The hospital room was immersed in a heavy silence, broken only by the constant hum of the machines monitoring Elizabeth's vital signs. She was lying in bed, her face pale and marked by fatigue, but her eyes held a serene glow that seemed to defy the gravity of the situation. Next to her, Michael held her hand, their fingers intertwined in a gesture that conveyed both love and despair. He looked at her, trying to find words of comfort, but the words seemed to elude him. How can you comfort someone who is facing death so calmly? Elizabeth closed her eyes for a moment, letting the stillness of the room envelop her. She was no stranger to pain. Life had taught her to be strong from an early age. After her husband's early death, she had raised Michael alone, working 2 jobs to ensure that there was never a shortage of food on the table. Now she was facing a different battle, one that couldn't be won with physical strength or relentless determination. The cancer, relentless and treacherous, had spread through her body, and the doctors had no more answers. She had only one weapon left, her unwavering faith in God. "Michael," she whispered, opening her eyes and turning her face towards him. "Do you remember the day you were born?" He smiled faintly, his eyes moist. "Of course I remember, Mom. You always tell that story." She paused as if reliving that moment in her mind. "It was the hardest day of my life, but also the most beautiful. When I held you for the first time, all the suffering was worth it. You were my first miracle, Michael." He squeezed her hand, feeling a lump in his throat. "And you'll continue to be strong, Mom. You always have been." Elizabeth smiled, but there was a shadow of sadness in her eyes. "I'm not afraid, Michael. I've put everything in God's hands. Whatever his plan is, I accept it." Michael looked at her, perplexed. How could she talk about acceptance when the end seemed so near? He had grown up in church, sitting next to her every Sunday, but at some point, the faith that had once seemed so natural had faded. Life, with its disappointments and losses, had eroded his belief. Now, sitting there, he found himself fighting against a maelstrom of emotions: anger, fear, doubt, while Elizabeth seemed to float above it all, anchored by a force he couldn't understand. The silence between them was broken by the sound of the door opening. Dr. Robert entered with a folder in his hands and a serious expression. He was a man of science, used to dealing with facts and figures, but something about Elizabeth's serenity made him uncomfortable. "Good morning, Elizabeth," he greeted with a cautious nod. "How are you feeling today?" She looked at him, her eyes soft but firm. "I'm at peace, Doctor. That's what matters." Dr. Robert nodded, but his expression was thoughtful. He opened the folder and began reviewing the latest tests. "Your results are worrying," he admitted, choosing his words carefully. "The cancer continues to progress. We're doing everything we can, but—" He paused as if he didn't want to finish the sentence. Michael felt his heart sink. He looked at his mother, expecting to see a reaction of fear or despair, but Elizabeth just smiled, as if she already knew it would happen. "Thank you, Doctor," she said simply. "I trust in God. He knows what he's doing." Dr. Robert studied her for a moment, as if trying to decipher the secret behind her serenity. He was a man of science, but there was something about Elizabeth's faith that made him question his own certainties. "Well," he finally said, closing the folder, "we'll keep monitoring, but it's important that you're aware of the possibilities." When the doctor left, Michael turned to Elizabeth, his mind racing. "Mom, how can you be so calm? How can you not be afraid?" Elizabeth looked at him, her eyes filled with a calm he couldn't understand. "Michael, fear is natural, but faith is greater than fear. I trust in God even when I don't understand what's happening." Michael felt a lump in his throat. He wanted to believe, he wanted to feel the same peace she felt, but doubt still haunted him. How could she trust so much in something he couldn't see or touch? As night fell over the hospital, Michael found himself walking through the silent corridors, the fluorescent lights casting elongated shadows on the floor. He passed rooms where other stories of pain and hope were unfolding, each unique but all connected by the tenuous thread of life. Finally, he entered the hospital chapel, a small haven of tranquility amidst the chaos. Sitting on one of the wooden benches, he looked at the crucifix on the wall, the figure of Christ, seeming to, look directly at him. Michael didn't know how to pray. He didn't know what to say. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a strange sense of calm. "God," he whispered, the words coming out in a string of voices. "I don't know if you can hear me, but if you are, please help my mother. Help me understand." The silence that followed wasn't filled with a heavenly voice or a miraculous vision, but with a peace that Michael hadn't felt for a long time. He didn't have all the answers, but at that moment it seemed enough. Michael was sitting in the hospital chapel, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes fixed on the crucifix on the wall. The stillness of the place was almost palpable, a stark contrast to the chaos he felt inside. The conversation with Elizabeth still echoed in his mind, her every word a challenge to his own beliefs, or lack of them. "How can you be so calm, Mom?" he had asked, his voice filled with incredulity. "How can you trust so much in something you can't see?" Elizabeth looked at him with that serenity that intrigued him so much. "Michael, faith isn't about seeing, it's about feeling. It's about knowing that even when all seems lost, there is something greater watching over us." He couldn't answer right away. Her words seemed so simple, so full of certainty, but for Michael they were like a puzzle he couldn't put together. Now, sitting in the chapel, he tried to understand what she felt, what she knew that he couldn't yet reach. Elizabeth's faith had always been an intrinsic part of her. He remembered how she prayed every night, giving thanks for the little things, a day's work, a hot meal, a tight hug. For her, God was everywhere, even in the simplest moments, but Michael had never been able to feel that. For him, life was a series of random events, some good, some bad, with no greater purpose. Now, seeing her face death so calmly, he felt torn. Part of him wanted to believe, wanted to feel the same peace she felt. But another part, bigger and louder, shouted that faith was just an illusion, a way of dealing with the fear of the unknown. Michael left the chapel with his thoughts still agitated, but with a slight relief in his chest. The peace he felt for a few moments was like a breath in the midst of the chaos that consumed him. He walked back to Elizabeth's room, where she was still sleeping, her peaceful face illuminated by the soft light of the bedside lamp. He sat down next to her, watching her for a moment. Even in her fragile state, she emanated a strength that he couldn't explain. As the evening progressed, Michael began to reflect on what family really meant. For him, family had always been synonymous with Elizabeth. She was his rock, his only, constant in a world that seemed to crumble every day. He remembered how she had always been there for him, even in the most difficult times. When his father had died, she had not only held the family together, but also ensured that Michael never felt alone. Now he saw himself in the role of caregiver, trying to repay everything she had done for him. But family wasn't just Elizabeth. There was also Jennifer, his wife, and their children, who were at home, away from the hospital. He missed them, but at the same time he knew he needed to be there for his mother. It was a difficult choice, and he wondered if he was doing the right thing. Jennifer had always been understanding, but he knew she was tired too. Looking after the children alone while he spent days and nights in hospital wasn't easy. The next morning, Jennifer showed up at the hospital with the children. Michael felt a mixture of relief and guilt when he saw them. The children ran to hug their grandmother, who woke up with a radiant smile at the sight of them. Elizabeth seemed to relive their presence, as if the mere sight of her grandchildren was a remedy for her pain. "Grandma, are you going to get well soon?" asked the youngest, her eyes full of innocence. Elizabeth smiled, stroking her granddaughter's cheek. "I'm fine now, darling. Being with you makes me feel better." Michael watched the scene with a heavy heart. He knew that Elizabeth was far from well, but the way she managed to convey hope and love to the children was something he deeply admired. It was as if she knew exactly what to say to ease the fear and uncertainty they all felt. Jennifer approached Michael, putting a hand on his shoulder. "How are you?" she asked quietly. He sighed, looking at her. "Tired, but seeing them here, it's good." She nodded in agreement. "She needs them, and so do you. Michael knew she was right. Family was what kept Elizabeth strong, and he needed to remember that. It wasn't just about being there for her, but also about allowing others to be. In the afternoon, while the children played in the hallway under Jennifer's watchful eye, Michael sat down next to Elizabeth's bed. She was more alert, her eyes shining, with an energy he hadn't seen for days. "Michael," she began, her voice soft but firm, "I want you to promise me something." He frowned, worried. "What is it, Mom?" "I want you to take care of Jennifer and the children. They need you as much as you need them." He felt a lump in his throat. "Mom, you don't have to worry about that. I'm taking care of everything." She shook her head, her eyes full of determination. "It's not about caring, Michael, it's about being there. I know you're trying to be strong for me, but don't forget them. They're your family too." Her words echoed in his mind like a painful reminder. He had been so focused on looking after her that he had almost forgotten that his family was bigger than just the two of them. Jennifer and the children needed him, and he needed them. That night, when Jennifer and the children left, Michael sat in the chair next to Elizabeth's bed, reflecting on what she had said. He looked at her, who was sleeping peacefully, and felt a wave of gratitude. She had always known what to say, always known how to guide him, even when he couldn't see the way. "Thanks, Mom," he whispered, holding her hand. "For everything." The next few days in hospital were a whirlwind of emotions for Michael. The presence of Jennifer and the children brought a little normality to the exhausting routine, but also highlighted the seriousness of the situation. Elizabeth, although still fragile, seemed more cheerful, as if the family's visit had rekindled a flame inside her. However, Michael knew that reality was relentless. The cancer was still there, and the doctors had no good news. One afternoon, as Michael walked through the corridors of the hospital, he came across Dr. Robert, who was reviewing a pile of tests. The doctor looked at him with an expression that Michael couldn't decipher, a mixture of caution and something that seemed almost hopeful. "Michael," Dr. Robert called out, gesturing for him to come closer. "We have the results of your mother's latest tests. Can we talk?" Michael felt his heart racing. He knew the tests were important, but the doctor's expression left him confused. He followed him into a small room, where Dr. Robert placed the sheets of paper on the table. "The results are unusual," the doctor began, choosing his words carefully. "The cancer seems to have stopped progressing. In some areas, it has even regressed slightly." Michael stood paralyzed, trying to process what he had just heard. "What does that mean?" he asked, his voice shaking. Dr. Robert sighed, as if he, too, was struggling to understand. "It means we're facing something we can't explain. It's not common for advanced stage cancer to stop growing like this, but it's important to remember that this could be temporary. We need to keep monitoring it." Michael nodded, but his mind was racing. He didn't know what to think. Was this it? The miracle Elizabeth had prayed for? He wanted to believe, but a part of him still doubted. How could something like this happen? When he returned to the bedroom, Elizabeth was awake, looking out of the window. She turned to him with a soft smile. "What did the doctor say?" Michael sat down next to her, still trying to organize his thoughts. "He said that the cancer has stopped growing. In some areas, it's even shrunk." Elizabeth didn't seem surprised. She just smiled, as if she already knew what he was going to say. "I knew God wouldn't abandon me." Michael looked at her, his eyes full of doubt. "Mom, how can you be so sure? How do you know this is a miracle?" She took his hand, holding it tightly. "Michael, a miracle doesn't have to be something big. Sometimes, it's just a small change, a sign that we're not alone. I don't know if I'll be healed, but I know that God is with me, and that's already a miracle for me." Her words echoed in his mind, and he felt a wave of emotion that he couldn't explain. Maybe she was right. Maybe a miracle wasn't about healing, but about the peace and acceptance she felt, even in the face of uncertainty. That evening, Michael returned to the chapel. This time, he wasn't there to ask for answers, but to give thanks. He sat on the wooden bench looking at the crucifix on the wall. and whispered a simple prayer. "Thank you for everything." The days following the news that Elizabeth's cancer had stabilized were full of contradictions. On the one hand, there was a palpable relief in the air, as if a storm had passed and left behind a less heavy sky. On the other hand, uncertainty still hung over everyone, like a fog that didn't allow them to see much beyond the next step. Michael felt torn between the hope that his mother might get better and the fear that it was all just a temporary respite. Elizabeth, however, seemed immune to doubt. She continued her routine of prayer and thanksgiving, as if the news of the tests was just another confirmation of what she already knew. For her, faith wasn't about medical results or prognoses. It was about trusting in the process, even when the future was uncertain. "Michael," she said one morning as he helped her sit up in bed, "you need to stop worrying so much. Whatever happens will happen. What's important is how we live the time we're given." He looked at her, trying to find some sign that she was afraid too. But there was none, just that calm that intrigued him so much. "How do you do it, Mom? How do you manage not to worry?" She smiled as if the question was simple. "I worry, Michael, but I also trust. Life is full of uncertainties, but faith helps me find peace in the midst of them." Her words echoed in his mind, but he still couldn't fully accept them. For him, uncertainty was like a shadow that followed him everywhere, a constant reminder that nothing was guaranteed. That afternoon, Jennifer brought the children to visit Elizabeth again. This time, Michael noticed something different about them. The laughter and jokes seemed lighter, as if the news of their grandmother's improvement had lifted a weight that he hadn't even realized they were carrying. The children ran to the side of the bed, telling stories about school and their friends, and Elizabeth listened attentively, her eyes shining with joy. "Grandma, are you coming home soon?" asked the older man, with an expression of hope that broke Michael's heart. Elizabeth stroked her grandson's face, smiling. "I hope so, darling. But in the meantime, I'm happy to have you here with me." Michael watched the scene, feeling a mixture of emotions. He wanted to believe that his mother would come home, that everything would be all right. But the uncertainty still haunted him, like a ghost that couldn't be ignored. That evening, after Jennifer and the children had left, Michael sat beside Elizabeth's bed, reflecting on the day. She was more tired, but still had that serenity that intrigued him so much. "Michael," she called, her voice soft but firm, "I want you to promise me something." He looked at her, worried. "What is it, Mom?" "I want you to keep believing even when I'm no longer here. Life is full of uncertainties, but also of hope. Don't let fear stop you from seeing that." He felt a lump in his throat, her words hitting him like a punch in the stomach. "Mom, please don't talk like that." She took his hand, holding it firmly. "It's important, Michael. Hope isn't about guaranteeing the future. It's about finding light even in the darkest moments. I want you to remember that." Michael couldn't reply. Her words were like a painful reminder that no matter what happened, he had to find a way to move on. The uncertainty was still there, but perhaps there was room for hope too. Time in hospital seemed to flow differently, as if each day were an eternity, and at the same time, the blink of an eye, Elizabeth continued to improve, slowly but steadily. The doctors still couldn't explain what was happening, but the tests showed that the cancer had not only stopped progressing, but had also begun to regress in some areas. One afternoon, as the sun was setting, casting a golden light through the bedroom window, Elizabeth asked to sit in the chair next to the window. Michael helped her, adjusting the blanket over her legs. She looked up at the sky, her eyes filled with a peace that Michael still couldn't understand. "Michael," she said, breaking the silence, "have you ever stopped to think that the real miracle is not the cure, but the way life transforms us?" He looked at her, confused. "What do you mean, Mom?" She smiled as if the answer was obvious. "The miracle isn't just that the cancer has stopped. It's the way you've changed, the way you've started to see life differently. It's the way Jennifer and the children have grown closer to you. It's the peace you find even in the midst of the storm." Michael felt a lump in his throat, her words hitting him like a revelation. He had never thought of it like that. For him, A miracle had always been something great, something that defied the laws of nature. But perhaps Elizabeth was right. Perhaps. The real miracle was the transformation they had undergone together. That evening, Michael returned to the chapel. This time he wasn't there to ask or thank, but to reflect. He sat on the wooden bench looking at the crucifix on the wall and let his thoughts flow freely. He thought about everything that had happened, the sleepless nights, the conversations with his mother, the visits from Jennifer and the children. And for the first time he felt that he understood. The real miracle wasn't the cure. It was love, faith, hope, and the way they had come together to face the storm. It was the transformation each of them had undergone, the way they had learned to value every moment, every breath. When he returned to the bedroom, Elizabeth was asleep, her peaceful face illuminated by the soft light of the bedside lamp. Michael sat down next to her, holding her hand, and whispered, "Thank you, Mom, for everything."